Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're speaking with David Worley. He's a podcaster and has his own YouTube channel, which I will link in the video description below. He just recently published a book titled Fantastic Fallacies and Where to Find Them. We have a great conversation about logical fallacies, the state of debate, and how to properly have difficult conversations. And I also want to say that there's now a Twitter account for the podcast. It's at BPTLLcast. You can also follow my personal account at Latent Physicist. We also have merch available, so if you're interested in a mug, sticker, shirt, or whatever, check out the link in the description of the video below. Anyways, hope you enjoy the video. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Awesome as always.
And we have a recurring guest. We have the return of the great David Worley. David, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks, guys. I don't know about great, but I am David Worley, so yeah, 2 for 3.
I'll replace great with wonderful. How about that?
Oh, it's too nice. It's too lovely.
No, you have to, no.
Disturbed and disgusting.
You have to embellish great, wonderful, excellent, Your Highness, God himself.
Your Highness.
I forgot. Sorry, this was America. Oh yeah. Yes, the exalted chosen one. I forget.
Yeah.
By many pronouns.
Many pronouns. Yeah. We over here in the States, for some reason, we always have to change the name of something that comes from Britain. I always refer to the first Harry Potter. In your country, it's the Sorcerer's Stone. Here, it's the Sorcerer. I forget. I shouldn't have said that. I'm not a big Harry Potter fan.
That's quite all right. I mean, I don't exactly have a copy to hand or anything. But it does say philosophers.
The Philosopher's Stone. There we go.
Philosopher's Stone.
Actually, over here, it's the Sorcerer's Stone.
Yeah, you're wrong. But that's okay. You know, that makes us feel better about ourselves. It's normal.
It has Brexit coming along.
We've just started to talk about it again.
Oh, wonderful.
Not that I have, but everything's just been on hold for obvious reasons. And I know. A friend, moderator, Pine Snake, was a conversation at some point. Bad Tempered Badger always wants a Brexit conversation. In terms of like in person social circles, I have more Remainer friends in real life, but then on the internet and guests on the podcast and that sort of thing, I've had more Brexiteers. So yeah, I'm definitely not in a bubble.
Yeah, certainly not. That's good. There's a great conversation that you had with Stephen Woodford about this topic, so I recommend everyone listening to go check that out. I think it was a fantastic conversation, especially since I'm someone who knows very, very little about Brexit since I live across the pond in the United States. But go check that out. It's great. We're entering phase 2 of this pandemic, though. How are you holding up in the pandemic, of course?
Pretty good. Considering, that the meme that comes out that says, I didn't realize my lifestyle was called quarantine. That basically applies. I'm very content to just be sitting still at the minute. And then you hear various different stories of people who are being a bit snowflakey on the on the Republican right. They really do desperately need their haircut, you know. It's so much more important than being alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so strange seeing these people make the argument that, look, clearly only around between 80 and 90,000 people seem to be dying at the moment, so therefore the original projections were too high. It's like, well, no, that's because we spread the curve and everything that we did was working. That's the expectation, and Sam Harris described this as the paradox that we were going to inevitably go towards, that if these social isolation and social distancing procedures work, then people are, of course, going to say that everything was just an overprojection. And like, well, we were going to hit this eventually, so
Yeah, it's the same for vaccines. It's the same with fixing anything. It's so easy to say there wasn't a problem in the first place until things majorly go wrong. You have to wonder where the line is drawn for these people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how many people around you that you know end up getting affected by it? You know, you mentioned Steve Woodford. Um, he just lost his dad.
Yeah, I saw about that. That's a shame.
So is it, how do you explain that? Yes, he was, um, as far as I understand, he was immunocompromised anyway. The way Steve explains it is that it was so quick in his deterioration after, as soon as he got it. I mean, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
It was like 2 days between him uh, sitting there having a conversation with him and then just passing away.
It's awful. One of the things that I can't imagine going through is losing a family member, a parent, or my sister. They're the people that I love the most in this life. And so when I saw that, it really, really just struck a chord with me, because that's the one thing I hate thinking about. And I can't imagine the pain that Steven is going through right now. I was going to ask him to come on the podcast, but I didn't, strictly because of that reason. I'm like, I can't, in good faith, take any of his time away from his grieving. So, and I know personally 2 people that were already infected. And in fact, and this is part of the problem here in the United States with the lack of testing. That's one of the people that I know who is infected with the coronavirus. They didn't even want to test him, actually, because they said they were so sure that he had it that they didn't want to risk or damage any resources in the process. And that just goes to show how dangerously low the lack of testing is here in the United States. And if we're ever going to lift these quarantine procedures up, first we need to get testing on board. How's testing going on over there in the UK?
Better, although it 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 doesn't ever feel like it's enough. And obviously that may be that because we're just being too critical of our government. But I ultimately think that we were far too slow to react.
Mm.
That doesn't help now. Going over what could we have done and that sort of thing. But in terms of the delay and Boris Johnson coming forward and saying on video, much like so very similar to Trump, in that he came forward and said, "Hey, look, I was in a hospital the other day. I was shaking everyone's hands. Everything's fine." And now we're what, 4th in the world for number of deaths. Like, we're an island. You would have thought naturally we have a geographical barrier between us and somewhere like the Schengen area, where I think we discussed this last time, where the Schengen area in the EU is basically as open border as you could possibly be between Spain, France, Italy, Germany, countries that are up there in the top 10. Germany have had a very low number of deaths. I don't know exactly why that is. I think they might have been a bit quicker to respond. But in terms of comparing the two and how we're closing the border and they're having their open border, you would have thought that they would have a significantly larger amount of deaths and that sort of thing. So we were very slow to test, and it still feels like we're not getting enough out. There was a story I was reading about how, if I get this right, is there's a company called Superdrug, which is just like a local pharmacist kind of thing. I've forgotten what it's called over there. It's not Walgreens. What's your pharmacy called?
We have a
Your
bunch:
main
Walgreens, CVS.
Yes.
CVS as well. Yeah, I was trying to remember them when I was over there.
That could
Yeah,
be
so
Walmart.
it could be. I think I was thinking of CVS,
Okay.
but in terms of like those major pharmaceutical high street brands. Superdrug is one of them, and they're doing like a testing kit for, I think it was £69 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
So it was the accusation being that they were playing on people's fears. And yeah, I should really read up a little better on the subject. I don't think it's been enough, and it's certainly when it comes to protective equipment for nurses and doctors, they're still saying they're not getting enough. So.
Well, so long as you and your family are great, that's a plus side over here. But yeah, so during quarantine procedures, I noticed that you were streaming yesterday. I think Sea of Thieves was that the game? How's your video game streaming career going? Is it sort of increased with quarantine?
Well, you know what? For some reason I wasn't restreaming on restream.io, whatever it's called, and so I can now put the gaming out on Facebook and Twitter all at the same time. So that's been on hold because of the book that we'll eventually get onto. But yeah, the gaming has been on hold. It's coming back now, but everything just came to a standstill for the book. So it's the podcast is now coming back. We've got at least a handful of guests coming up. I'm trying to think of sort of when this will be out compared to, I'll say that I've already had people on, as it were, and then there might be a last minute change, and so I won't say exactly who. But you mentioned Stephen Woodford, so that's one for people to look out for.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned your book. I think we should probably jump into this book. I think it's incredibly impressive that you decided to write a book with the amount of work and dedication that is required. I can't imagine that it must have been easy. What made you want to write this book, and what was the process like?
So this is only a very short book, so it's 80 pages, but in terms of trying to get as much information across as possible, I try to be as articulate and as succinct as I can, because I can't do it while live streaming. In live streaming, you just got to keep talking until at least you've reached like an hour or hour and a half or whatever. So it's very different trying to write and then try to do the audiobook and realize your writing could improve slightly. So in terms of the process, it's been pretty much 1 month exactly between opening that file for the first time to it being released on paperback and available as we speak. Mm-hmm. So the actual process, originally the book, or rather the podcast, was going to be a book, and I was trying to fill it out. I was trying to bulk up the book with lots of interviews so I could just transcript it, and that eventually became the podcast because I couldn't be asked. And it's just better because it's video format and that sort of thing. So I went back to that idea. I felt like I was sufficiently educated to speak on this subject of logical fallacies. I by no means, disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I think there are probably mistakes in the book that I can't see for myself because I read what I'm writing and it says what's in my head, not what it actually says on the paper. So that's when you get proofreaders to come in and then they say, actually, you've just got 100 mistakes. And it's like, yeah, now it's obvious. Yeah, now that you mention it. There's bits where I'd sent off the manuscript to Amazon, and then I noticed a glaring mistake. I don't think anybody actually purchased it while it was up because you can't pre-order it on paperback for some reason. It just goes live and that's it. So with a review process from Amazon, of course, but I'd missed out on there's 50 fallacies, and the first one is straw man. And I'd just took the titles and a brief 10 words, like what that fallacy is. Next one. So there's one chapter which is Fantastic Fallacies, which it just lists the 50 fallacies and explains it in simple terms. Then Where to Find Them is the next chapter, which goes into more detail. So you get a page per fallacy in that respect, just explaining what it is, what the some examples, and then small little suggestions on how to counter it. So at least how I would counter it. This is not a book that goes into massive depth in terms of 10 pages or 20, 30 pages all on one fallacy, and you have to know the entire history of every fallacy that's on every philosopher. This is just the raw bog standard. This is what it is. This is how it's used by theists and flat earthers, or conspiracy theorists, or whatever. And there may be a few little bits just to say, hey, maybe just think about getting them to question themselves over, why they believe what they believe, the source of where they got it from. So the actual process was very straightforward. I was in touch with Rachel Oates over her book. She made a mock parody of Gabby Hanna's poetry, and she got Kyra, her dog, to pick between two bits of paper. There was a treat on either of them, and then Kyra would go to that one, and so these words would go into the poetry. She made a whole book based around that concept. And so she went through independent publishing on Amazon. And so, that process is very straightforward. There's some little bits of terminology that didn't quite make sense, but once you are used to it, there's only maybe a couple of dozen things you have to input in terms of, title, authors, version, do you own the copyright, manuscript, artwork, pricing, all of that then produces it, goes off to Amazon. Within a few days, it can be live. You can set a pre-order for the ebook, not for the paperback. Don't know why. But in terms of the process, it's very straightforward. I always wanted to focus on content to bringing in people who are completely new to the subject, that are starting from zero, because there are too many people that are coming forward highlighting the fact that there is this barrier. So I was talking to Jen Aldrich, and she'd done a video very recently. For those who don't know, she's at the ACA. She does Godless Bitches, occasionally does Atheist Experience, that sort of thing. And she was saying, look, there's a barrier for women in particular getting into the community, because they feel like they need to reach a certain threshold of knowledge. They need to know what the cosmological argument is, the teleological, whatever it may be, what's made chronology, and all these different fallacies. And you have to start with that knowledge, otherwise you're sort of like an outsider. And so we really need to help those people, raise those people up, so they're all on the same level. And so, to conclude my not so brief diatribe, it's basically trying to help bring them up to scratch.
Mm-hmm. That's laudable. And I was trying to find your book on Goodreads.com. I don't know if you're aware of what Goodreads is. It's basically a Facebook for book reading, and I couldn't find the book. I don't know how the process of trying to put it up on there goes.
You know what? By the time this is out, I'll make a note of that, because at the minute it's an Amazon exclusive, so it would be paperback, ebook, and eventually audiobook on Audible. As I said, by the time this comes out, it might already be there. Okay. So was it Good Book Reads?
Yeah, Goodreads.
Oh, Goodreads.
Yeah, just one word.com. I really think that if you can do anything at all to get your book on there, David, it could really help you promote it because it's a social media site for not readers specifically. Well, yes, readers specifically, but in regards to literature, you can take notes on Kindle, share them with your friends, have discussions online, and even rate and evaluate other people's books. It's a good way for to get publicity out there.
Yeah, sure. I'll definitely look out for it. Yeah.
Okay. So, underlying logical fallacies is sort of an attempt to have an honest conversation, right? But before you dig into such deep conversations, I think it's recommended to acknowledge Rapport's rules. So, would you mind going through what that is? You sort of start the book off with that.
Yeah. So, Rappaport's rules is extraordinarily difficult to keep to when you're having a conversation. So, if our aims and objectives are to convince the other person that we are right and potentially that they are wrong, we have to fulfill certain criteria before people accept our criticism. If we come forward and we just criticize, then all they see is you're having a go at me, you're attacking me, you're um, you're you're basically just building a wall between us. And then it's a confrontation. Whereas if I prove to you that I understand what you think and I can articulate what I think, then you know that I'm not just completely ignorant on the subject. So the Rappaport's rules consist of 4 rules. First one, you have to be able to articulate the other person's position accurately, preferably to the point where you describe it better than they do. Secondly, you say where you agree with the other person, especially on points which you won't necessarily get very common agreement upon. So you're not just throwing something out there that's basic and generic. You're throwing out there something that, hey, not very many people would agree with you on that, but I do, because I think that's really important or whatever. And then they start to respect you more. The third step is saying what you've learned and what the other person has taught you. This goes on into another concept within the book called modeling, where you're demonstrating the behavior you want to see from others. And so if you want them to admit what they're learning from you, you have to reciprocate. So once you've fulfilled those 3 criteria, you then have a solid foundation in order to then criticize somebody. So you don't just have like 100% of your interactions as criticism to the point where you end up viewing that person as, oh, here we go. What have they got now? And this could be a family member. This could be somebody on the street. It could be someone on the internet. It's like every time I see them, they're going to criticize me. And I know those people. I've muted people on Twitter because that's all they do. Whereas actually, it's healthier to sit down and say, this is your position. I understand your position. This is where I agree. This is what I've learned. I did actually know that. But I do disagree here. And that structure at least appears very difficult to have in practice, but very beneficial if you're trying to convince somebody of your argument.
Mm-hmm. Now, just for the sake of familiarizing my audience with the whole concept of logical fallacies, because it sounds like something that people would immediately and intuitively understand what a logical fallacy is, but I think it goes much deeper. So would you mind sort of giving a quick synopsis of what a logical fallacy is, just generally speaking?
No idea. So a logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning. You have your belief, and then the foundation to that belief, what's propping that belief up, is a series of evidence or reasons or a particular structure which can be flawed. Mm-hmm. So let's think of a good example. If I said there was a newspaper article saying that, I don't know, there was a plane crash. But it came from a newspaper that I don't trust because it's lied so many times about the president, about this issue, that issue, and I don't trust, I don't know, Fox News, CNN, it doesn't matter what it is. It would be the genetic fallacy to suggest, well, they've come forward with a true statement. This plane crash did happen, but it came from this source, so I'm not going to trust it. I'm going to reject it straight away. I mean, Fox News said it, therefore it must be wrong. You know, that's a fallacy. They do say some true things, but it might not be as many true things as another source. So we have to look at an individual claim and say it may well be true, regardless of who it, you know. Trump is a very controversial figure. He might say something that's true. Say, for example, when he was very recently having a go at something that we've already mentioned, Boris Johnson's slow response to the pandemic. That's true. But if it's coming from Trump, people will reject it. Now, I'm not saying that therefore you have to accept everything he says, because I agree the majority of what he does or what he says or the way he acts isn't as good as it could be. But it would be fallacious to draw that conclusion just because of who he is. And so we've got to have some good reasons for believing what you believe. It may be that, let's think of some good examples. The non sequitur is a very easy one to explain, but it's a very difficult one to identify in people because it can just be a series of truth statements. So, for example, if I say grass is green, statement 1. Statement 2, rabbits eat grass. Therefore, C, the sun is at the center of our solar system. Now, those are 3 statements that are true, as far as I'm aware. Last time I checked, but they don't link together. They don't cause one another. And so it's still what's called a non sequitur fallacy. The previous statements don't follow, or rather the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. So that would be flawed, and as such it's called a non sequitur, which in Latin means it does not follow. So there's loads of these different fallacies explained in the book, whereby we might be having various different ideas that are propped up with bad reasons. Now, it's not that the conclusion is wrong. You can have bad reasoning and a good conclusion. If we say this was a bad reason to believe something that they use, say Bruce thought that swimming was healthy for you, to swim, twice a week. That's I would consider that a true statement. But if he says you should swim because the pixies told me to, that's based on bad reasoning. You can't just base it on something that you cannot prove. Like, pixies haven't been shown to exist. And so the conclusion is still correct. And if I were to come forward and say, well, you've based it on pixies, so therefore swimming twice a week must be bad, then that would be called the fallacy, in which I've said, you've used a fallacy, you've used bad reasoning, therefore your conclusion is wrong. Whereas actually, no, it could be a good conclusion. It's just being propped up for bad reasons. Another example would be apophasis. I actually did this yesterday or the other day in the podcast with Shane, because I said, if I was sexist, I would say, and then I just said whatever I said, right? But that's still fallacious. Now, apophasis is denying you're saying something when you are. So if I say, a lesser person would bring up your alcoholism, But I'm not like that. I wouldn't do that. But in saying that sentence, I'm bringing it up. It's a way of saying something like an ad hominem and then retracting responsibility for actually saying it in the first place. And we do it all the time, even so much as like I did it the other day, and I've just released the book. So it's don't think of me as some sort of god when it comes to this. I'm completely susceptible. I think my main message to conclude is that we have to make a conscious effort to reduce the number of bad reasons we have for what we believe. We will never get to zero. We will never get to the point where we are machines and we will never make a mistake, because we will. We're emotional. We succumb to attacking other people. We succumb to appeals to volume if we're hungry and we're stressed out and somebody else is shouting at us in our faces. We're more likely to shout back. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't make our argument stronger. So, yeah, to conclude, I hope that I really, really hope that people are following the conversation. For people that are listening, a fallacy is a bad reason for believing something.
Now, without going too deep into sort of the conversation surrounding normative ethics, how do you maintain an honest conversation? What would be the point of being cognizant of our logical fallacies, right? So, like, for instance, if engaging in logical fallacies increases the likelihood that you would, quote unquote, win the debate, then, or the conversation, or what have you, like, because it can unfairly, like, confuse the opposition and give you an unearned advantage, why wouldn't we use logical fallacies to our advantage?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. So ultimately, at the end of the day, somebody's going to call us out for it. Now, in terms of when we're following the scientific method, I think it will go strip all the way back to what I would say is my aims and objectives are to stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible. In order to do that, I need accurate, truthful information surrounding me. Say, anti-vax is a very good example. You can prop up several bad ideas that lead to harm if we end up using logical fallacies. So this could be a very interesting conversation if we go into trying to justify what we would consider bad ideas, but could they be propped up with good reasoning? So flipping on its head, if you had a good reason but a bad conclusion, I would say if there's good reasons, and if there's sound, logical reasons for believing in a particular idea, they are preferable to bad reasons. So when it comes to like a good conclusion being propped up by bad ideas, you might think of the amount of charity work that the Catholic Church has done, for example. So they're doing what they do because they think they're getting into an afterlife, right? And because that is something that hasn't been proved, it's an appeal to faith that's based on various different fallacies, but they have come to a good conclusion in that they should do charity work. Now, they have done it, albeit for selfish reasons. They're trying to get themselves into a position with their God, where they're a bit more cozy. But you don't need to invoke bad reasoning in order to do charity work. Now, it goes back to the argument that you hear quite often from Matt Dillahunty when he has somebody call up and they come up to him about ethics and that sort of thing, and they end up concluding that this particular caller will say, right, well, I'm going to probably go out and rape and murder people if I were an atheist. To which point we then say, well, stay in the faith. If that really is what's stopping you from doing such horrendous actions, then fine. Like, that's a good thing. Ultimately, that's slightly consequentialist of me. I think, in terms of explaining it, in terms of humanism, I think we did discuss this last time, where I said the total amount of pain and total amount of pleasure in these two sort of boxes, as it were, these two measurements. If we can maximize pleasure and minimize pain, then that's preferable. So in order to do that, removing bad reasons, removing fallacies from our everyday conversations tends to, in practice, lead to more pleasure, less pain. So as much as you can find nuances in terms of, say, the Catholic Church argument, and somebody's done a good thing because of bad reason, more often than not, people do bad things because of bad reasons, and people do good things because of good reasons. And there seems to be a correlation between the two. So if we want to be better people, if we want to be more moral, I would argue that we should remove fallacious arguments from our reasoning. But I don't know what you might think.
David, I have two questions that are related to logic. Being someone who tries to err on the side of rationality, and being someone who values evidence, I see the absolute necessity of being able to recognize logic from logical fallacies. But Sam Harris once posed the question: how do you get someone to value evidence when they don't see the value in evidence? And my question here, to tack on to that, my own personal question to the first of two, is how do you have an honest conversation with someone who constantly deflects, who doesn't commit a fallacy per se, but someone who tries to brush aside the point of whatever you're trying to say? And to give you a quick example, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who swings Republican, and we were having a conversation about Donald Trump, and his intelligence, or lack thereof. And I was speaking to this person about the differences, the clear differences in how Trump and another president, not a president, another a prime minister, I believe, like whatever, Justin Trudeau, I don't know what they call him in Canada, to see the differences in how the two speak. And Trump, you can really ever get him to speak in complete sentences, and his exhortations are a complete mess. But there was a clip of Justin Trudeau, who someone asked him about the idea of quantum computing, and he starts giving a very, very brief summary as to how quantum computing works. And I started along that example, but this person interrupted me, and she knew we were discussing intelligence, but she kept stating, "What does a supercomputer have to do with this? What does a supercomputer have to do with this?" I'm like, this is an example I'm using to illustrate the logic in my statement, and you're just sweeping it all aside. Have you ever had conversations along this line? How do you navigate your way through something like this?
So it's worth mentioning that somebody can be right and not very good at articulating themselves. So you could have true statements from somebody like Trump, who cannot complete a sentence typically without going off into some tangent. But yeah, I think that typically there is a correlation between those that can talk very confidently on a subject and those who tell the truth. The problem is there's also a massive correlation in the Venn diagram between con men who are very good public speakers and those that do actually know what they're talking about. So in terms of the specific example you give, I would question what they're and like immediately question why it's an issue to bring up quantum computers, because there's an issue there that might need to be addressed. Like they have a particular distrust for scientists, engineers, experts, and then trying to find out where that comes from. What's the root of that distrust? It may well be that it might be the genetic fallacy. It might be that they're getting the information from particular sources in which they are particularly biased towards. And those sources are saying the intelligent, the people like the computer programmers like Mark Zuckerberg are, they're multi-billionaires. They don't represent real people. They don't represent the sorts of people like you and I who end up, having to scrape by, working so hard. They just get millions a day for doing nothing. These sorts of arguments, they might be basing their opinion on intellects on something like that. So constantly question, first of all, where that comes from. Their lack of distrust on that source. If someone is being particularly fundamental in their ideas, show a genuine interest in trying to find out what their opinion is. And this will end up going straight back to Rappaport's rules. So the first rule is being able to articulate the other person's perspective. Now, I don't know what your ability is in terms of articulating that particular person's perspective, but in terms of having a conversation with them where voices aren't getting raised, there isn't too much conflict, then just question them. Just question them, constantly question them. The specific questions I would ask, it's not just what your opinion is, how they came to that opinion, but how much, it sort of goes into street epistemology a little. How much confidence do they have in that particular idea? What criteria would need to be met for them to change their mind? In other words, what could falsify their idea? If they're still being very stubborn, flip the table. Make you the victim of the argument, and I have to word this very carefully. So what I mean by that is be self-deprecating to the point where you can say, right, I don't actually believe in this idea. I'm just going to give you a different example.
Sure.
And then I've got, I could say, I believe in aliens. I believe in ghosts. And then they start to question you. And you prop up that idea with the same reasoning that they did for their idea. And so you demonstrate to them, actually, you do have a problem with this structure and this reasoning. You're just not applying it to your ideas. So you can say, is there any difference between the reasons I'm giving for this idea and the reasons you're giving for yours? And then put them next to each other. And make it as clear as possible, especially if you can have it written down and highlighted. So you can go in a proper syllogism. Statement 1, statement 2, conclusion, aliens. Statement 1, statement 2, therefore they distrust intelligence or whatever. And then highlight number 1 in yellow. They're basically the same sentence. Number 2, highlighting green. They're both exactly the same sentence. Conclusion. And then they can go, yeah, that's bad reasoning here. But then they look at this and they go, actually, yeah, I'm doing exactly the same thing. And it's not that you should then turn around and go, haha, checkmate, I win, or anything like that.
That's counterproductive.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be completely counterproductive. Remember, in this specific example, they are not going to change their mind while you're standing there. They will go away for a few days. It's the moments when they're doing the laundry, when they're making the bed, that's when they're going to have these ideas, when they're doing some sort of manual labor, and they're going to say, remember that conversation? Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's got a point. I mean, it does sound like a very similar argument. And so, as long as, again, as long as you come across as kind, as long as you're coming across as somebody who genuinely wants to understand the other person, not just attack them, then they're far more likely to change their idea. I hope that helps.
It does, but you may have just answered my question just right there. But there's something there's something else I did want to run past you with the same person I had a conversation with, and we're still about the remaining question I still have is how do you get someone to value evidence? And logic is something that's really propped up and extolled by people like you and me and Vincent and several others we know, but not many seem to realize that from all the way back during the time of the Greeks, we have a structured system that explores relations between syllogisms, premises, and conclusions. We buttress logic with evidence to make the points we need, but I'm still not sure how to argue with someone who's dismissive of evidence, or at the very least evidence that just doesn't fit their biases. And it's incredibly frustrating to do so when you get the implication of your bias as an excuse. To give you another example, a conversation with same said person um, occurred once a few years ago, in which we were discussing the U.S. Constitution, and this person heard this document being referred to as a social contract, which is a term used by Enlightenment philosophers. And this person, who's fairly right wing, was just incensed by the use of that phrase, and made some kind of virtue signally conversation, saying like, you're likening it to something as trashy as Facebook or the social media we have these days. I didn't see the logic in her argument, so I told her that, you know, this is a social contract. It's a document written by some incredibly smart and intelligent people to outline the work that outline the rules, the things you can and cannot do, so to speak, in a democracy. And it was very apparent early on. You know, she didn't know who John Locke was. She didn't know about anything about the Enlightenment philosophers or the second treatise of government, anything that went into developing Western style democracies. And it was very apparent that she didn't view the Constitution as a document written by intelligent people so much as she viewed it as almost a religious document. And what was incredibly telling was at the end, after we got done with the discussion, she came up to me and says, "I want to know what you've been looking at, what you've been researching." And the implication was that I was reading bullshit. But strangely enough, she did not offer any kind of erudite response or even any kind of counterfactual historical points or any kind of evidence, which I thought was very revelatory. And by the end of it, I was like, "Holy shit! This person doesn't seem to value evidence." Um, how do you argue with someone who just speaks along those lines? It's an incredibly difficult process.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to try and have just so much as have the conversation. If you can, first and foremost, maybe slow the conversation down with them, take things a bit slower, speak a bit more deliberately, but don't patronize. Just, you know, you're not talking to a child. You're talking to, you know, somebody who I'm guessing is intelligent, is capable of these, you know, understanding. It's just very difficult to get across. So it sounds like the source is the problem as well. They were questioning your sources for your information. So that it could end up being a very small step towards the genetic fallacy. In that case, don't necessarily explain fallacies to them, but in terms of trying to understand where they get their information from, and if this is a conversation, is this a conversation you get to have with them more regularly, or was this just like a coming together at a protest and then you never see each other again?
No, we speak regularly about this. I don't usually bring it up because our conversations in this regard, when I start pressing a little bit, the person I'm speaking to in question tends to get incredibly defensive, especially since this happens more often than not. And so I only engage when this person engages. But we have the kind of relationship where we can speak back and forth along these lines, but the results are almost always inconclusive because of this.
Okay, right. So the one thing I write in the book, if you're having confrontational conversations to the point where every single time it's confrontational, to the point where you're saying you're even avoiding having a conversation until they bring it up, then I would recommend switching to a written conversation. Because if you can come together and say, hey, a friend has suggested, when you have confrontational conversations, you don't really get anywhere. And I do genuinely want to have a healthy relationship with you, and I don't want things to go sour just because we disagree. And so what they suggested is, which is what I'm suggesting now, is have a written discussion in which you determine a particular structure in that conversation so that neither of you waffle on for too much. Okay, you can throw in sources. That's recommended. You have some sort of word limit. So a debater like Richard Carrier would have written debates over a number of months with somebody in which they can properly think through that argument, have 1,100 word limit. You could introduce the rule that says you have to start the letter by acknowledging what the other person said in the previous letter. So again, Rappaport's rules, this is your opinion. As far as I understand it, let me know if I'm missing something. Secondly, this is where I agree. Thirdly, I didn't know about this particular thing. I'm going to learn more about it. Have you got any sources that you could give me for that? And then you've already got 3/4 of the piece of paper is stuff being genuinely interested in what they have to say. Then the criticisms will come at the end, where you can say, okay, I'm questioning this particular idea, this particular source. It all depends on the very specific thing that they're saying, but in terms of let's say what are they actually saying in terms of their reasoning, their underlying epistemology, as it were.
And what are they actually saying in that particular argument?
Yeah, so in terms of what are they propping up their opinion with at the minute? Are they propping it up by saying this source is wrong, you're wrong because you're stupid? Are they shouting a lot? Are they, I'm trying to work out what fallacies they're using.
No, it was the argument pretty much came down to the Constitution is almost a sacrosanct document that is so sacred that it's that's what it was. And my argument was, no, it's a smart document, but written by smart people. It's not a it's not a religious paper that is not up to debate or anything of the sort. Yeah. And the thing is, there was no evidence that she brought to the table to support her view. And when I brought evidence to up for discussion, she didn't respond in kind. Instead, she made an accusation. And yeah.
So first and foremost, from your asking you now, can smart people be wrong?
Yes.
Right. So saying that they're smart isn't necessarily a good reason to put forward to them. So in terms of trying to convince them, they already might have their own biases, and that's wrong. In terms of trying to be effective with that particular person, say, okay, let's pretend we are starting civilization today. Nuclear war ravaged the rest of humanity, and it's down to us two. And we've now got to come up with some sort of constitution, and then let them go first. What would you think is really important to have in the constitution? Do they even so much as value having a constitution? And then try to go into specific arguments. Is it a good idea to have this, have that? Do you value freedom of speech? And then you can go into arguments like, do we have freedom of speech for people that we disagree with? And they might be like, well, I don't like when Nazis have freedom of speech, and neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, and I completely disagree with them, and I want to shut them down. Okay. Then you might go into a conversation, again, just working ad hoc, as it were, but if they go down that line, you might say, okay, what stops them from coming to you and saying, oh, but you with all your liberal ideas and your pro-gay, pro-abortion, whatever views it might be, couldn't they just as arbitrarily make the same argument against you? Couldn't they, go into that sort of conversation whereby you're constantly making them question, oh, there's a really good reason why we have, I think, is it the plead the fifth, where you have the right to remain silent? Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I did actually read the Constitution earlier, just today, because I went skimmed through it, trying to see whether it was true. I was checking one of my own fallacy, or one of my own ideas, because I hear within these circles that the Constitution doesn't mention God, Bible, Christian, or anything like that, and I've just taken that based on the word of the people who have said it. I haven't actually gone to the Constitution to check, so I thought, well, I might as well check. So earlier today I did check, and it's right. I mean, it just takes a very quick search on, I think it's constitutionus.com, and you just search for this word, no matches, So I'm also susceptible to biases. But where were we going with that? So they don't value evidence.
So what right? So what I hear you saying is like, if they don't quote unquote value evidence, then it's incumbent or important for someone like myself on the other side to walk them through an example to show them their line of reasoning and what kind of evidence they would need in order to support their views, in order to get them to value evidence in that respect. Am I representing your position correctly?
Well, yeah. In terms of when they say evidence, they probably have a completely different definition for evidence, and so they do value it because they have their own sources that they consider evidence. But we might have a different definition of evidence, why we're saying it has to be scientific, peer-reviewed. It needs to be, remove all biases. The amount of people that have taken part in the survey can't be like 8 people. It needs to be thousands of people to verify solid information. And then that test needs to be replicable and verified by other groups across the world. It can't just be true over here. It has to be true everywhere. So you can walk them through that, but as soon as I mention the word scientific method, science, they might already have a bias against that, and they consider science our evidence, and so they might be anti-science for some reason that we need to find out.
Right.
So further question exactly what they consider evidence, how we come to a truth conclusion. We typically, in order to come to true conclusions, it is more likely that we're going to come to truth if we're using solid arguments. So you always try and, I would say, it might just be because I'm English, I always try and deflect to the point where I'm not making the person I'm talking to the subject of the conversation. I always say, right, somebody over there thinks, rather than you think. And those sorts of rhetoric devices, as it were. So instead of saying solid, like this is this, the Constitution is this, say, well, I think it's this. I could be wrong. What do you think of that? Then people are much more willing to have a conversation. But initially, because I'm talking quite a lot, initially I would recommend gearing your conversation towards being able to feel comfortable having further conversations. That's your first step I would recommend, so that you can then feel comfortable going into more depth and challenging them a bit more, because I think they might have already put up a certain barrier. I'm not saying that is your fault. It may be that they are just particularly, they're geared towards anyone who disagrees with me is an enemy for whatever reason. So I hope that helps.
Do you think that there's got to be like a spectrum of fallaciousness when it comes to these sorts of topics, like whether or not some fallacies are more fallacious than others? Like so for instance, in the section on the false equivalency fallacy that you brought up the fact that some people may liken the current slaughtering of animals as a 21st century Holocaust. And this is propped up as sort of like a false equivalence because it's clearly not the same thing. But however, couldn't this be used as an accurate comparison to try to demonstrate the horrors of not going veganism? And I've thought of like some gripes that I have with other fallacies as well. For instance, the dictionary fallacy is one that I sort of have a problem with, because I think one of the main things that we need to have sort of illuminated in these sorts of conversations is definitions. We need to know what we're talking about. So if I think resorting to the dictionary, I think, is a very helpful way of illuminating what type of conversation it is that we're having and what it is that we're talking about. So do you think there's a spectrum of fallacies or like of how fallacious a fallacy is? And could there be some problems with some fallacies that you have?
So I think I'd answer that in terms of trying to. I don't know. I don't think in terms of one thing is particularly more fallacious than another. I think we can look at the result and we can say, well, this led to harm, or this was fairly innocuous. I mean, say for example, appeal to volume might intimidate, but an appeal to faith might result in somebody getting a death sentence. Nobody's going to get a death sentence from an appeal to volume. So in terms of the actual consequence of a particular fallacy, then yes, definitely. But I would just consider if you've used the fallacious argument, then it is equal to every other argument. In terms of the actual example you gave on false equivalence, so sorry, I got hiccups. Not sure why. I haven't had any carbonated beverage for a while, but a false equivalence would be saying two things share a trait, therefore they are considered exactly the same. So it would be something along the lines of my head. we're both guys, therefore we're just the same in every aspect of, the way we treat women, the job prospects, ambitions. That's clearly not the case. All right. So if I were to then start making a false analogy, and I explain the difference between the two, as far as I understand it, a false analogy shares trait A, therefore they share trait B. You can almost think of false equivalence as saying they share trait A, therefore they share all other traits. So a false analogy would be saying something like, well, Stalin's an atheist, and I'm an atheist, therefore I must be, a mass murderer. Like Stalin. I mean, that's clearly fallacious. In terms of the vegan example, I think there's better arguments that could be put forward for veganism rather than. I mean, I'm not vegan, but in terms of the actual arguments in favour of it, exaggerating, and I think it is exaggerating because, as I explain in that on that actual page, Jews were slaughtered because they were seen as inferior, and not just Jews, but it was anyone who was, not in line with the Führer. Whereas there is an understandable reason why we would slaughter animals. It's not necessarily for fun. It is for some, but for the majority of everybody else, it's a highly nutritious way to stay alive. It's very nutrient dense. It's dare I say healthy. I mean, you can argue that it isn't, given the wet markets and that sort of thing. And that's another thing that gets brought up at the minute. Wet markets in Wuhan that cause these pandemics are obviously unhygienic in that respect. Therefore, we must get rid of the entire meat industry. It's like, no. Like, we have managed to keep meat healthy for such a large quantity, not just time, but in terms of the amount that we produce. Like, it's relatively speaking just as healthy as any plant. I mean, plants have all sorts of pesticides in them, and arguably they could be passed on to the animals when they are eating them, but I don't think. I think we would be making the argument from ambiguity, in that not all plants are the same as the specific plants that are fed to animals. I don't want to get into a conversation too much on veganism, because I mean I could, but I don't think that's answering the question. Mm-hmm. Is this remotely in line with answering your question?
Yes, of course. And
I feel like I'm going off.
No worries. But if anyone out there wants to know his views on veganism, check out his debates that he had with Cosmic Skeptic on this, because
okay.
Not a
debate.
A podcast. Yeah, the conversation. Certainly not a debate. But that could lead us. Yeah, go for it.
I was only going to say that he makes some very good points, but I do think there are some fallacious arguments I wasn't quite quick enough in that particular discussion to refute. I think when he says things like switching to a vegan diet, like all these fake meat products that are coming out, like fake chicken nuggets and the sort of thing that flexitarians would eat, isn't what actual real vegans eat, as it were. Not to, I'm not sure whether that would be considered a no true vegan fallacy. It's no true Scotsman, but yeah, it certainly comes across as an appeal to emotion sometimes. When, even though he did deny it, when it says his idea, he says, is that well, think about how the children of the future are going to judge you. And it's like, well, they're not even born yet. They don't have any cognitive ability. They don't have a brain. They're not even a fetus yet. I can't just project an opinion onto future children that don't even exist yet and say they're going to judge you for not going vegan. Like, why did you eat meat in the past in 2020? And it's like, well, I could make exactly the same argument and say the children of the future are going to see veganism as a fad. They're going to judge you. But there's exactly the same argument propping it up. So it would be an appeal to emotion to try and guilt trip me into saying, oh yeah, they're going to judge me, therefore I should stop. So there's specific bits that I can now articulate that I couldn't before in that conversation, but it's well worth going to that podcast.
Yeah, and sort of segueing into the topic of what type of conversation. So we basically put forth the idea that we should have honest, diplomatic conversations, and even veering a bit into the terrain of straight epistemology. But do you think that there's a place for ridicule? So Lawrence Krauss once said that ridicule helps illuminate the reality of a situation. But do you think that this method is probably best resigned for sort of the type of Hitchens-like debates where two people are face-to-face in front of an auditorium, and because of the fact that you're not trying to convince the person sitting across from you, the people that you're trying to convince is the auditorium, really, is this probably the best place for ridicule, or should we never use ridicule in general?
So it was brought up when Kristen, one of the wonderful mods within the community, was proofreading. She noticed that straight after I put in a Christopher Hitchens quote saying, I think it was appeal to faith, where he says it's called faith because it's not knowledge. And then immediately the next fallacy is grandstanding. She picked up on that reference because Hitchens grandstands all the time. He looks to the audience and tries to get that sharp quip to make them laugh, and then that gets into a compilation video that is the only thing we now see of Hitchens. And in terms of gaining ground, the firebrands, definitely there is a place for breaking the mold, as it were. So if there is this figurative mold that exists, then I would say yes, there is definitely a place for ridicule. As long as you're not making it at the expense of the other person, and you are making it very clear that you are ridiculing the idea. So if you're perfectly polite and kind to that person and give nobody any reason to dislike you, I could then ridicule a particular idea, but I don't have to do it at their expense, and I don't have to do it in order to get a reaction out of the crowd. It could just be us two having a conversation and me reducing your argument to absurd proportions in order to try and make you realize actually that reason is bad. I think if you can do it in a sensible conversation kind of way, then you should. But there's definitely a place for the firebrand. There needs to be. I think there's every reason as well. There's certain examples I want to give. I don't know if you saw the conversation, the debate between Atheist Pastor and Darth Dawkins.
No, I have not.
Okay, because Atheist Pastor, Chris, Atheist Pastor in Australia did a great job of highlighting this. You're aware of Darth Dawkins?
He's the Christian apologist, right?
Yeah, he's a precept, and he'll just have his same script. And all Atheist Pastor did was start by saying that he'd converted to Hinduism. And as far as I understand it, that's also like a Trinity-based religion. And so his argument was like, how can you differentiate between this Trinity story and this Trinity story? They're exactly the same structure. Like, why do you pick this one? Because you were born believing in it, or whatever reason it was. And so you can ridicule in a very smart way. You don't have to try and play for laughs and to make cheap points. You remember the Hitchens moment where he's with Rabbi, don't know his name, and he says, "Let's call it evil." Where does evil come from? And Hitchens jumps in with religion, and everyone's like, "Oh, Hitchens is so great! Oh, so much." Like, that didn't answer the question. So you can play to an audience like that, but I don't have the personality for grandstanding or being a firebrand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't want to put too much stress on my heart.
Yeah, and it's always abundantly clear just how effective it is when someone with the wit of Christopher Hitchens is compared to someone with the witlessness of Dave Rubin. And I'm saying that because I'm reviewing Dave Rubin's book right now, and so that video is coming up, and once that video comes up, it's going to become abundantly clear that I'm not a fan of him. But going on to the next question, do you think that, and this is something that I've been thinking about recently, so do you think that our inability, or some people's inability, I should say, to have conversations is a meme that can eventually be controlled? So the last time you were on, we talked about religion, and I've argued that religion is a maladaptation that can be outgrown, and I see it being outgrown, widely speaking, in the future. So if we view our tendency to be unreasonable as a tribalistic and selfish adaptation that has been given to us by evolution, do you see that as being potentially outgrown, as it's now become a maladaptation, given the rise of globalized socialization, given the rise of social media? It's becoming less and less necessary to just be so strident and fallacious against the opposition. Do you think that eventually, in the same way that I view religion is going to be outgrown in the future, that this tendency to use logical fallacies all the time is going to be outgrown?
Fair point. Because we did go into futurism a little. I think there's a risk that the majority is pretty much always challenged.
Mm.
And I mean, if we're going to be, I don't like the wording of this, but if we are building our empire, quote unquote, then it will not last forever and it will eventually fall. So how do we safeguard in the future? I think it's very difficult to try and picture a world in which there is so much pushback in terms of just in terms of saying, but you use the logical fallacy. I mean, you value reducing logical fallacies. Well, that's getting boring, or whatever specific argument it may be. It's a very interesting one to think about. I think to an extent we are seeing that now because of the anti-expert narrative. Even so much as our education secretary in the UK, or former education secretary Michael Gove, one of the key Brexiteers, was saying during the Brexit campaign for Vote Leave that the public's had enough of experts. And I think that's more to do with control and telling somebody what to do. So in terms of the actual pointing out fallacies, then that can still continue, but it's the way that we do it. So if I come across as obnoxious in any way when pointing out somebody's flaws, then I mean that might come back to the firebrand point. Because if there's too many firebrands, then we get the reputation that we've got now, whereby we've got, I know several people who are now complaining that because of the Hitchens grandstanding and that sort of thing, and just so much as Dawkins making that great speech about the great juju up the mountain at that university. I mean, it gets a huge cheer, but it also sounds like mockery. So I think there's a lot to be said for trying to change the way in which we are having conversations to a much more respectful tone. I think if our aims are to convince people to value noticing fallacious arguments, then we must act in a particular way in which our message is going to be interpreted favorably. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in order to be interpreted favorably, we need to be liked. That's unfortunately the case. We are not a race of Spocks in which we can just detach insults. So I can do it very easily. I just have a conversation and somebody might insult me. I just bat it off. Like, I'm trying to really focus on the point that they're saying. If they said something like, if you actually bothered to read such and such book, then you would know that whatever claim they're making. So at that point, we can have a conversation about the point they're making, or have a conversation about their insult. And more often than not, people have a tendency to go to a particular part of their brain. I think it's the amygdala, the older part of our brain, our evolved ape part of our brain, not the frontal lobe, like the
Right,
new
the
logical
amygdala.
rational bit. The amygdala. That kicks in, and we immediately value the insult over the argument. If we can create a tendency within society, internationally as well, in which we see the benefit and promote the idea that we should strip that away from what they said. Okay, they insulted me, they're angry, they could have, something might have happened to them. They could have family death because of the pandemic, or, they woke up late, they're hungry, they had a bad argument, a bad day for some reason. Then we can start to go, actually, I'll lower my tone, lower my volume, go back to Rappaport's rules, value what they're saying, even if the conversation is solely just them talking and me listening, which is complete opposite of what I've done in this podcast, because I'm talking a lot. But yeah, valuing what the other person is saying and really trying to get to the point in which they're making that they may not be able to articulate yet. And that first rule for reports is not just being able to state their position, it's being able to state their position better than they can, especially if they can't articulate themselves. And that goes a long way to having a healthy conversation and building respect. Because if you build respect, people won't necessarily go back on what you say. Yes, you can have a cult of like a hero person, cult of personality. What is it? Like a hero fallacy, in which we idolize the likes of Hitchens and Dawkins, and we don't criticize them as much because they're part of our little in-group. If we can value the actual conversation and making sure it's as sound as possible, as reasonable as possible, and being as polite as possible, then we're ultimately going to, I don't want to use the word convert, we're going to convince as many more people that we're right as possible. So in one sentence, if I could insult somebody and get a cheer from 10 people, but then 100 people hate me, and I instead talk through the argument, I value the other person, I thank the other person for engaging in the conversation, explaining to me, teaching to me various different concepts, then I might have a greater likelihood of convincing 100 people that I'm right. And then 10 people might think I'm weak or something like that, or, complete opposite. some beta. It was Jesse Lee Peterson was shouting that over Professor Dave and a debate the other day. Like, it was just like beta, the whole debate. And so, sorry, I did say one sentence. If we can convince 100 rather than 10, then we should always go towards that particular method. I waffled. I apologize.
No, it's great. We're here to promote your book and yourself as a human being. So I think that's fantastic.
Honestly, the book is way more succinct than I am. It's like I could read that in an hour and it's done. The audio book will eventually be out, probably by the time this is out. But yeah,
okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
And you're writing another. Did I remember correctly that you're writing another book as well, or you were going to at least?
Don't name it. Don't tell them. Yes, I do reference it because I reference the Lance and John situation in the book, and people will get that reference straight away. If you're there's too many little words and sentences that will just pique your interest in that particular passage. But yeah, I definitely plan to do more. At the minute, with the amount of fallacies that could be spoken upon, I at the moment, in my head at least, plan for 4 Fantastic Fallacy books. The first of which is we are discussing now and is out. Then they will get compiled into a 5th book, like a complete works with bonus material and just a load of other stuff that didn't make the other books. And then I've already started, and the first book I started was on rebuttals to theist arguments. So think of Fantastic Fallacies as this introduction, this friendly beginner's guide to fallacies. Then this 6th book on rebuttals to theists is more intermediate in terms of you have to understand what the Kalam cosmological argument is and how I'm refuting it, and how I'm going about having a conversation with somebody. So yes, there's plenty more material on the way, subject to how much I'm cooped up indoors. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Dave, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. As always, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Everyone go check out his podcast. He interviews a bunch of atheists. He's the Joe Rogan of atheist YouTube, as he likes to call himself. Check out his gaming content as well. You have a Twitch channel, right?
Twitch.tv/WorleyDR.
So it's always an honor to have you on the podcast. It's great. Everyone go check out his content. And once again, thanks, Dave, for coming on the podcast. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Anytime.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking Out Loud. If you liked this podcast, be sure to subscribe for more content. We have consistently great conversations with people like Genetically Modified Skeptic, Lloyd Evans, and James Lindsay. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Latent Physicist. Also follow the podcast Twitter at BPTOLcast. As always, it was a pleasure to serve you, and I hope to see you in the next podcast.